They fired her in front of everyone, colleagues she had quietly supported, managers she had respected without question, and a workplace she once believed in more than herself. There was no warning, no explanation that softened the blow, only clipped words delivered in cold air and followed by stares that avoided hers. Her face remained calm, but inside her, something deep cracked. Not a loud break, but the silent kind that collapses quietly in the corners of the soul. As she picked up her few belongings, the weight wasn't in her bag, but in everything she had set aside for this job. Her dreams, her skills, her voice. They took away a position, but unknowingly returned something far greater. What they thought was the end became her beginning. In that moment of public dismissal, she found something stronger than revenge clarity. And from that silence, she rose with a resolve that no one saw coming. The walls around her didn't tremble, but something inside her did. Not the kind of trembling that causes tears or fear, but the kind that signals a shift too quiet to be noticed by others. The room was filled with the sound of clacking keyboards, distant phones ringing and muffled footsteps, yet none of it touched her. She stood still as if the noise had passed through her like wind through an abandoned home. Eyes that once smiled with routine politeness now flickered away, afraid to hold her gaze. Not because of what she had done, but because of what they had witnessed, her removal, her dismissal, her erasure. Yet in that stillness, she wasn't thinking about the embarrassment or even the injustice. Her mind moved elsewhere, scanning every moment that had led her to this very second. The overtime hours she gave without request, the birthdays missed, the ideas stolen in meetings, the kindness she poured into tasks no one noticed. Everything rushed through her like a quiet storm. Her body walked, but her soul lingered behind, taking one last look at a place that had demanded so much and given back so little. She didn't feel failure. She felt freedom, though it wore the clothes of heartbreak. The moment her foot crossed the doorway, the air changed, not outside, but within her. The kind of change that doesn't come with anger or fire, but with clarity. A glass-like awareness that showed her everything she had ignored. The years she spent shrinking so others could feel taller. The dreams she shelved, so responsibilities could sit comfortably. The laughter she swallowed, so her seriousness would be respected. Each step forward peeled away layers she had forgotten she wore. Her name was no longer tied to a title or a paycheck. It was free, unfamiliar, raw, and yet powerful. What they saw was a woman leaving a building. What they didn't see was a woman returning to herself. She walked without knowing where her feet would take her, not to escape, but to breathe. The city moved like it always did, unaware, unmoved, but something in her had slowed. She paused near a coffee shop she once passed every day without noticing. Its window pane held her reflection not as the woman who was just fired, but as someone she no longer recognized. Not because she was lost, but because she was finally seeing the version of herself she had buried under expectations. That face staring back didn't wear defeat, only exhaustion. An exhaustion built from years of saying yes when she meant no, of proving her worth in rooms where she was never truly seen. Behind that glass, she saw not just herself, but every moment she had dismissed her own needs. The long nights spent catching up on work she wasn't paid extra for, the skipped meals, the quiet tears, the dreams whispered into pillows, because no one ever asked what she really wanted. It all floated there, invisible to everyone else, but painfully clear to her. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She stared until the glass stopped showing her face and started showing her truth. She was tired, not just from the job, but from the pretending. And in that silent revelation, she realized the job didn't break her. She had been breaking for a long time, piece by piece, smile by forced smile. The firing was just the final crack that let the light in. She stepped back, not from fear, but from knowing the world hadn't changed. But she had. That single reflection had shown her everything she had missed. And once a woman sees herself without the masks, she cannot return to the life that required them. She kept walking, not to run from what happened, but to walk toward what waited. Something uncertain, perhaps, but entirely her own. She didn't go home, not because she had nowhere to go, but because home no longer felt like a place. It felt like something she needed to build inside herself. First, the quiet corners of a nearby library offered her a chair. Not comfort, but space. Space to sit, to exist, to think. Around her were books filled with stories, voices answers, yet none spoke louder than her own silence. And in that silence, she began to construct something. Not a plan, not yet, just thoughts layered like bricks. For years, she had watched others take credit for her ideas, wear her efforts like armor while she faded further into the background. But here, in this still room of pages and dust, she began writing lines in her head, not for others, not for applause, but for herself. Not a resume, not a cover letter, a manifesto of remembering, a place with no doors, no ceilings, no judgments. She envisioned a space where her voice wouldn't be filtered through permission. A room built not with walls, but with self-worth. She listed no achievements. She measured no timelines. She simply sat with the truth of who she had been before she was told who to become. And slowly, that truth took shape. She didn't need to ask anyone for an opportunity anymore. She would create her own. Not overnight. Not loudly, but with the quiet fury of a woman who had been overlooked one too many times. Her past didn't feel like weight anymore. It felt like wood for the fire. Every mistake, every compromise, every time she stayed silent. They were not scars now. They were blueprints. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she knew what she would never return to. She closed her eyes, not to rest, but to begin. The room she had built within had no boundaries, only direction. And for the first time, she felt like she had one too. She rose before the world asked her to. Not out of habit, but because something inside had stirred. A quiet determination no longer waiting to be named. There was no alarm, no schedule, no one expecting her. And yet her steps felt urgent. She didn't rush toward a job, a desk, or a deadline. She moved toward a blank page, a screen, a space where her thoughts could finally breathe. For years, her voice had been trimmed to fit templates edited to please silence to survive. Now unshaped by approval, it came raw, trembling, and real. She wrote, not with elegance, but with honesty. Her sentences didn't chase beauty. They chased truth. She didn't wonder if anyone would read it. That wasn't the point. She wasn't trying to be heard. She was trying to be whole. Her story poured like a confession. Only the brave dare whisper, touching the parts of herself she had locked away in fear. The doubt still hovered. The memories of rejection still pulsed. But her fingers moved anyway, carving a trail of resilience across the blankness. Each word was a step away from silence. Each paragraph a small rebellion against the years she had been told she wasn't enough. There was no applause, no audience, no promise of reward. But she didn't stop, because this wasn't for them. This was for the girl inside her who had begged to be seen. And as her truth bled onto the page, something unexplainable shifted. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for validation, not for recognition, not for permission. She was building something stronger than approval. A voice that didn't need to echo to matter. A presence that didn't need a spotlight to exist. She wasn't louder than before, but she was unfiltered. She wasn't trying to impress, but she was unforgettable. And in that quiet revolution, she found what she hadn't known. She lost herself. Her story, once hidden in the corners of notebooks and forgotten drafts, had begun to travel. She hadn't shouted it from rooftops. She had simply released it piece by piece into the world raw, unpolished, honest. It found people not through algorithms or strategies, but through truth. A kind of quiet gravity pulled eyes toward her words. She didn't chase attention. It arrived without ceremony. The ones who read her didn't applaud. They paused, they stayed, and they remembered. Her story became a mirror for strangers, a reflection of pain, unspoken strength, untapped dreams buried under survival. It wasn't viral. It was vital. In boardrooms where she once sat unnoticed, someone read her words and didn't look away. In coffee shops, her paragraphs were screens glowing in trembling hands. She didn't know most of them. She didn't need to. Her echo had reached where her voice couldn't. And then the call came. Not from a recruiter or a manager, but from someone who had been changed. They didn't offer her a job. They asked for her vision, not her resume, not her past titles. Her perspective, the same thoughts she was once punished for, now became a blueprint for something new. She walked back into a room similar to the one where she had once been fired. Only this time her presence didn't tremble. Her chair wasn't pulled out for her. She pulled her own forward. She didn't demand respect. Her silence made them listen. The same people who once dismissed her now sat still waiting for her to speak, but she didn't need to raise her voice. The echo had already done that. She stood not to prove anything, but to build something that couldn't be taken from her. They saw her not because she asked to be seen, but because she no longer needed them to. And as the room leaned in, she realized this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a world she created from nothing but what they tried to erase. Her fall had made them look away, but her rise. They couldn't stop watching. They thought ending his job would extinguish something. They believed a termination letter could snuff out all that he carried, his vision, his dignity, his potential. But what they didn't understand was that his flame wasn't dependent on their recognition. It had been lit long before he ever walked through those office doors, long before he sat in meetings where no one remembered his name. His flame had burned quietly through long nights of rejection and silent dreams. They mistook his silence for surrender, but silence was where his fire grew. Every moment they overlooked him. Every time they made decisions without him. Every smirk that followed his ideas. All of it became fuel. And when they tried to end him, they simply gave him the freedom to burn brighter. His days after the firing weren't spent in despair. They were spent in rebuilding, but not like before. This time, he didn't rebuild to fit into rooms. He rebuilt to create new ones. Rooms where people didn't have to beg to be seen. Where dignity wasn't a luxury handed down by power, but a foundation baked into every conversation. His work, once dismissed as too emotional, too soft, too slow, became a blueprint. Others began to follow when their own fast-paced systems failed. The very empathy he was told had no place in business became the thing people sought when the world became too cruel to bear. His documents, once deleted without reading, now spread through networks not because they were pushed, but because they healed. The fire they thought was gone still burned, not in protest, not in revenge, but in creation. Every message he wrote, every voice message he sent, every quiet late-night post, they all carried that same flame. And those who had once turned their backs began to feel the warmth. Not all at once, but one by one, their cold certainty began to crack. Not because he fought them, but because he kept glowing when everything else went dark. In a world that worshipped noise, where shouting was mistaken for strength and quick replies were seen as intellect, he chose silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that some truths needed space to echo. While the world raced to be heard, he stood still, and that stillness became his advantage. The people who once ignored him started to notice the absence of his presence. In crowded rooms, his name became the unspoken question. Where was he? What was he building? Why was he quiet? His silence began to speak louder than their noise ever could. It wasn't empty, it was intentional. While others scrambled to maintain the image of success, he worked in the shadows away from applause, away from validation. And in that silence, ideas bloomed. Deep, thoughtful, unapologetic creations that didn't need meetings to matter. What he built in solitude carried depth. It wasn't rushed, wasn't reactive. It was rooted slowly. People found themselves drawn to the spaces he created, not because they were trendy, but because they were true. His voice, when it did appear, was no longer a whisper lost in the noise. It was the calm in the chaos, the pause that made people listen. He didn't beg for attention. He became the moment people paused for. The same silence they once saw as weakness now felt like leadership. Because in a world that constantly told people to do more, chase faster, speak louder, he reminded them what it meant to be still, to think, to feel. His silence became the mirror others couldn't look away from. Not everyone understood it, but those who did were changed. They didn't just hear him, they felt him. And for the first time, they realized that maybe they had been listening to the wrong voices all along. He never planned a grand comeback. No announcement, no vengeance, no fireworks. Just the quiet return of a man who had outgrown needing permission. While they were still operating within the same broken systems, still rewarding surface-level charisma, he had built something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. His return wasn't about reclaiming what was lost. It was about showing what could never be taken. The same people who once dismissed him now studied him, not because he demanded their attention, but because he became undeniable. His name, once associated with failure in their halls, now floated in conversations about change, about meaning, about impact. He walked back into their world, not to fit in, but to expand it. He didn't wear suits anymore to look important. His importance had become untouchable. He didn't raise his voice to compete. His presence had become enough. People who once overlooked him now looked up to him. And yet, there was no arrogance in his steps, only purpose. He carried the same heart they once called too soft. But now it was seen as strength, because he had done what few dared to do. He let himself be broken and then chose to rebuild without bitterness. He returned not to prove them wrong, but to prove himself right. And in doing so, he became more than a man who was fired. He became a symbol that dignity cannot be stolen, that failure isn't final, that silence can be power, and that sometimes the ones who are thrown out quietly are the very ones who change the world without ever needing to knock.